Hey everybody, how's everybody doing with Trailhead DX today? Good? Awesome. So if you're here for this session, it is called Sandbox Dataset Optimization. I don't know if you're using a lot of different sandboxes and trying to populate those sandboxes, try to show you how we can do that with OwnBackup. So my name is Matt Kennedy, I'm the sales engineer here at OwnBackup. I'm excited to share the secrets of optimizing sandbox datasets and increasing developer productivity. As you know, sandbox environments are critical to developers and architects. You don't want to be doing changes in production. Really try to utilize those sandboxes before you push changes to production. You can get a full sandbox that has all your data, but as you know, full sandboxes can be kind of expensive. You usually only have one, so you want to be able to use all those other sandboxes. A little bit about me. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem since about 2009. I am Salesforce certified admin. I do have a lot of years of developer experience, so kind of familiar with this topic. Any questions at the end, please feel free to ask me. A little bit about OwnBackup. So we are here. We're out in the exhibit area. If you want to come by and actually see the application, I can walk you through the steps to run a replication, run a sandbox seeding. We are one of the top-rated backup providers on the Salesforce App Exchange. We do encourage people to go out, read the reviews. Obviously, it's people like yourself that are using the application, have found use in not only the sandbox seeding, but also the backup and recovery of Salesforce data. We've had a couple awards in terms of Gartner Cool Vendor. We've been a Salesforce ISV Innovation Award. And we do a lot of demo jams. I don't know if anybody's back there yesterday. We actually won the demo jam yesterday. Pretty exciting. So, managing your sandboxes, I want to take a couple minutes just talk about the challenges that developers such as yourself face day to day in utilizing sandboxes. So we did this thing, we found this study, and they said 52% of top companies release Salesforce changes at least once a month. So if you're pushing those changes into production, you want to make sure that you're utilizing those sandboxes, run all your testing through the sandboxes before that data goes into production. When we look at that, there are errors that happen. So if you're making changes directly in production, according to a study by Cluster HQ, 43% of app developers, those unhappy little guys there in red, spend between 10 to 25% of their time debugging application errors discovered in production. So once it's in production, it's a huge problem. If you can get that debugged, coded, tested in Sandbox first, you're going to avoid those issues of live users having a problem with that data. That means almost half the developers out there are wasting a significant amount of time pushing code rather than developing new features. They're going to be fixing things instead of actually doing real development, and they're going to be scrambling with unhappy users. So this sort of work for Salesforce developers, admins are trying to avoid when testing and doing that work in the sandboxes. So in terms of the importance of sandboxes, we really looked at these three things, okay? Developing, you want to be able to run that code, be able to push everything in the sandbox first before you go to production. All the testing, right? It's a critical part of the Salesforce ecosystem. You're going to use these for all these different purposes, and it's going to let the developers and admins safely build and test new features, updates, workflows without impacting that production environment. But the biggest problem is getting relevant data into those smaller sandboxes. As you know, if you're working with a partial sandbox, a developer, a dev pro, you got limited capacity. So you can't put all that production data into that smaller sandbox. So let's quickly run through a couple of the challenges that you get with testing in those sandbox environments. So we look at it as there's 5 challenges that you have with seeding a sandbox. So the first one is maintaining full sandboxes is expensive. I don't know, does everybody here have full sandboxes, or a good number of you do? Awesome feature, right? But they are expensive. If you want to get a second full sandbox, there's a large cost to it. So we definitely encourage people to use those other sandboxes whenever possible. And I don't know, if you're using those sandboxes, are you populating them with data loader or kind of going through a manual process and trying to put those relationships back together? So we really want to make sure you can get use out of those other sandboxes. So when you're working with those small sandboxes, how do you get good data in there? If you're testing with like incomplete information, if you have an account without a contact, an opportunity without a count, that information is not going to be good. You're not going to really be able to get relevant testing. So moving that relevant size to fit test data in a sandbox can kind of be like using a funnel to filter all the sand for this dump truck, right? How do you get just that small set of data you want? If somebody came to you and said, hey, I'd like all the accounts here in San Francisco. I want just that data into a sandbox with the related contacts, with the related opportunities, the tasks, and just move that set of data into the sandbox. That's really the challenge that you face. If you don't wind up with irrelevant data, you want just that specific set of data. If you're testing with irrelevant data, you're not going to get true tests. So you wind up, the test pass, you think everything's good, you push it into production, and now you're going to find a problem because that data wasn't good. The reason it's so difficult for many developers and admins to get relevant size to fit test data is because they can't easily select a part of production. They can't just pick a subset of records and bring that down. So you need to be able to refilter and refine that test data, exclude attachments if you want, and then bring down all the relationships, all that, maintaining that integrity of all those related objects. So if you bring down those accounts, you're going to get all that related information. The other challenge is, what if that data is confidential, right? So if you're bringing down live production information into a sandbox, you want to be able to mask some of that information. You want to be able to change name, address, email, so that you have pure test data. If you need to give that to an outside developer or a consultant, you're going to be able to give them pure test data and not worry about your live production information. So developers cannot always fully test without irrelevant data, like I talked about a few minutes ago, and it's going to cause bugs. The reason it's difficult for admins to get that data, again, because there's no easy tool to just select that subset of information. So providing that unauthorized access to confidential can be a liability for the company, right? If you're taking that production data, moving it to a sandbox, and then giving it to an outside consultant, you're potentially exposing sensitive information. So we think it's important that you be able to analyze or anonymize that data when you're moving it out. So when we think about using these sandboxes, we really talk about development cycles. We want to make sure that you're getting that good data, being able to do the testing, and moving all that information, once it's good, into production at that point. So, when you're doing those Salesforce, those sandbox refreshes, those full refreshes can take a long time. With this smaller set of data, you can populate those sandboxes much quicker. The other thing, I guess the key feature that we look at is when you're moving that production data down to the sandbox, a lot of times you don't want to fire off all the related workflows, triggers, processes, validation rules. So in our solution, we actually have the ability to turn those off. So if you kick off the replication, it's going to turn those off, populate the data in the sandbox, and then turn it back on when you're done. So it's really going to be a one-for-one. When you're taking that production data down to the sandbox, you're going to get record for record without firing off a bunch of processes and creating additional data in that sandbox. So when you're, if you have a developer working on a specific project and you want to give them just this amount of data, they're going to get exactly that information and nothing more. The other thing that we look at is, because we back up data and metadata, we can do cross-org comparisons. So if your developers are working in that sandbox and they're getting ready to push it to production, you could run a metadata compare from production to that sandbox, and you'd see exactly what's different between those two environments. So before you push that change set to production, you can find out, hey, somebody added a new workflow, a new validation rule in production that I wasn't aware of that could potentially impact this change set when I push it up. When we do those metadata compares, we're going to show you exactly between any 2 points in time what the metadata looked like then and what it looks like now. You would see anything that's been added, changed, or deleted over that time. So it can be really helpful if you're looking at that org and you want to know exactly what's changed in production. We can identify right down to the object and the record what's different between those two environments. So when we look at all those challenges, we think there is a better way. And with OwnBackup, we do have a pretty complex tool for sandbox seeding. So you see some of the advantages here. Obviously, speeding up development cycles. You're going to be able to utilize all those developer sandboxes, all those partials, be able to get better use out of them so your developers have good data. They're not all working in that same full sandbox. They're all working in separate individual sandboxes. The select, preview, and refine that perfect training set data. You're going to be able to go in, select the objects you want. So you can select multiple parent objects, and by default, we're going to go 3 levels deep on the hierarchy. So we're going to do parent, child, grandchild relationships. But if you have a really complex schema, we can go up to 5 levels deep. So children of grandchildren, children of their children, we're going to move all that data over as well. You know, pretty challenging when you're trying to figure out all those relationships, all those lookup relationships. All that data is going to come over with it. So that's that maintaining that relationship integrity automatically. You don't have to worry about selecting the child objects. They're going to come along with that selected parent. We can do both large and subset of data. So you can do 10 records if you want. You can do thousands of records if you want. It all depends on the capacity of that sandbox. So if you're working with a dev sandbox of 200 meg, you're going to have to keep that set pretty small. But if you have a Dev Pro, if you have a partial sandbox, you can populate that with more data. Talked a little bit about that anonymize your test data. So again, we're going to mask that information so that is pure test information in that sandbox. Talked a little bit about the compare the data and the metadata. And then the ability to manage multiple orgs. So we can back up all of your production environments as well as all your sandboxes. And then you can move data from one org to another very easily. Because we're backing up that full sandbox, I don't know if everybody here, when you refresh a full sandbox, you know what a challenge that can be. You're obviously got to make sure that everybody has all the data out of that full sandbox before you do the refresh. Because we have a backup of the old sandbox, if you refresh it, you can move data or metadata from that old sandbox forward to the refresh sandbox. So it definitely helps you with those refresh cycles. And like I said, just managing the multiple orgs. I'll throw it open if anybody has any questions specific to either sandboxes or how our tool can help you populate those sandboxes. Any questions? So we don't do scratch orgs yet. People have been asking about that. I think it's a great use case. I'm not sure that the scratch orgs are available through the API yet. So everything we do is through the Salesforce API. They are? You're giving me a thumbs up? No, he is. So that's something we're looking into. I had a bunch of people ask about that today, right? If you spin off a new scratch org and you want to just populate it with some good test data, it's a great use case. So we are looking into that. I don't have the answer for it just yet. Good question, though. Thanks. If anybody would like to see this, in 5 minutes, I can walk you through the screens, actually show you how to select your source environment, select the objects that you want to replicate, filter down to that subset, and then set your destination org and actually bring the data over from one org to another. Yeah, so you can go up to 5 levels. So by default, it's going to be 3. You can do 1 layer. If you just want the parent object, you can do that. But by default, we're going to do 3. That's kind of what most people are looking for. But if you have a really complex set of objects, we can go to 5 levels deep. What's that? Yeah, the anonymization. Yeah, so it'll actually, it's going to mask personal information, right? Name, address, email, phone number, social security, credit card information. Any encrypted field will be masked as well. So that sensitive information is going to be converted as the replication's running into fake names, fake addresses, fake phone numbers. Awesome. Thank you. If anybody, like I said, if anybody wants to come by and see it, we can do it in a couple minutes, actually walk you through the whole process. Thank you.